Nidhi madam.
Thank you.
Nidhi madam.
Yes, sir.
DP Mathuria sir, ED Technical is also joining.
Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday Gyan Ganga Lecture Series presented by Vigyan, Prasar and National Mission for Clean Ganga. I, Dr. Nidhi Srivastava, project scientist from Vigyan Prasar, welcomes you all. And it's my honor to welcome the esteemed panelist of today's session, Dr. Anthony Acciavatti, School of Architecture at Yale University, Shri Rajiv Ranjan Mishra, sir, Director General, National Mission for Clean Ganga, Shri Jagmohan Gupta, Advisor, NMCG and retired Joint Secretary and Financial Advisor of Department of Water Resources, River Development and Ganga Rejuvenation, Ministry of Jal Shakti, Dr. Dinesh Mathuria, Dr. NMCG, Dr. Arvind C. Ranade, Senior Scientist and National Coordinator, Rejuvenate Science Clubs, Vigyan Prasar, Shri Piyush Gupta, Assistant Real-Time Information Specialist, NMCG, and Mr. Vipin Singh Rawat from the Rejuvenate team of Vigyan Prasar. I also welcome all the club members, Ganga Praharis, Ganga Doots, who have joined us through the YouTube or the Facebook pages of NMCG and Rejuvenate pages for this session today. Thank you everyone for joining the session. As you know that the Ganga River is one of the major living streams on the planet Earth and very important river system in India. The Holy River is a lifeline for approximately 500 million people. Over the last 150 years, the ancient river basin has been transformed into one of the most hyper-engineered landscape on Earth into a vast water machine. Today's speaker, Dr. Anthony Acciavatti, in 2005, initiated a decade-long systematic study and comprehensive mapping of the infrastructural transformation of Ganga to understand how human interventions and engineers have shaped its water management and use. His study combines techniques from the arts and sciences to dynamically visualize the unwieldy water machine. In today's talk, Sir will speak about the historical development of the basin, as well as competing demands between urban growth and the agriculture for water and land. The talk will be as usual of 30 to 40 minutes followed by an interaction session. I appeal to all the participants that if you have any queries or questions regarding the session, you can type it in the comment section of the YouTube box or the Facebook page. We will take them one by one once the talk is over. Now to begin the session, I request Shri Jagmohan Gupta sir to please speak and give the welcome remarks for today's session. I invite Jagmohan sir to please address the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. If I can say, good morning, Dr. Anthony Acciavatti. I've heard so much about you, and I always felt when they introduced you and we are discussing about this talk, you appear to be a saint in India, because I have lived in India, but you from America, you came to Ganga for about a brief period and decided and extended your stay for a decade. That's an amazing. So I feel you are a saint. The perspective you have on Ganges, most of us aspire to have that perspective. A large audience is available now. The Ganga Mitra, the Ganga Praharis, and all kinds of groups have joined this talk. And I'm sure, since you are the walking encyclopedia on Ganges, so I look forward to this talk, and it will be very enlightening for all of us. So I'll not take much time and invite Dr. Acciavatti for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I request Arvind sir to please introduce our today's speaker. Over to you, Arvind sir.
Good evening to all Indians, and of course, good morning to Anthony Acciavatti, who is, today is our very special guest on this Ganga Gyan Ganga Lecture Series. Of course, our joint partner Namami Gange, which is largely known as National Mission of Clean Ganga in India. The esteemed member Dr. Jagmohan Gupta ji, Joint Secretary Namami Gange, Dinesh Mathuria, Vipin Gupta ji, and of course other dignitaries from the Namami Gange, And today's very special guest, and of course, I would say already Dr. Jagmohan sir has already mentioned to all of us that he is really a saint, especially for the Indians, because he has very categorically mentioned that we all Indians living in India are certainly have an importance for the Ganga. But of course, a person who really, not only fall in love with the Ganga, but he has, very dynamically studied the whole ecosystem of Ganga. And today he is, giving, enlightening all of us based on his research work and the work that he has made all of us to understand what the, nature's gift that we have and how we should protect this Ganga in a larger scale. So with this, all VIPNet Club members across the country, I really feel very honored to have our guest today, Professor Anthony Acciavatti, who is going to be elaborate more on the today's topic to all of us. And it is a great privilege for me to introduce him. Anthony Acciavatti is a historian, cartographer, and architect. He currently teaches at the School of Architecture at Yale University. His most recent book, Ganga Water Machine in 2015, is the first comprehensive mapping and urban history of the Ganga River Basin in over half a century. He spent a decade hiking, driving, and boating across the Ganga in order to map it and to understand the historical conflicts over water of drinking, agriculture, and industry. In 2016, Ganga Water Machine was awarded the 2016 John Brinkerhoff Jackson Book Prize, along with the book Ganga Water Machine is an internationally traveling exhibition with recent shows in New York, Mumbai, and New Delhi. His work has been supported by the grants and fellowship from the National Science Foundation and Princeton University, along with the Graham Foundation and Yale University, where he was a fellow in the program in agrarian studies. And his work on the Ganges by Johnson William Fulbright Fellowship, as well as a grant and fellowship from the Ford Foundation and Harvard University. A founding editor of a manifest, Journal of American Architecture and Urbanism. He has also written for the New York Times, Cabinet, Indian Express, Architectural Design, and Tops among the others. He has worked as an architect in the Europe, South Asia, and North America, and is a principal of the Somatic Collaborative in the New York. He has taught at Princeton University and Columbia University, as well as the Rhode Island School of Design. A personality who is a very dynamic, has a very great source of knowledge for all of us. And I really, in the very beginning, I must say that thank you, sir, for taking your precious time to enlightening all our very excited people in India who really would like to know about the work that you have been doing. And at the same time, I must thank the whole NMCG. And I could see that Director General, sir, has already joined to us. And I think it is who can be better than him, who will really grace the occasion. So before I come to you, I will certainly welcome Director General, sir, and I will request him to have a few words before we could invite our speaker of the day.
Thank you. A very hearty welcome to Dr. Anthony. So nice seeing you after quite some time, though even if it virtually. And you are most welcome during your next visit to India to visit us. It's really I'm really very happy to welcome you on behalf of Namami Gange Mission, as well as Vigyan, Prasar, and several other organizations and several other people who are virtually joining us. I was so impressed with his work when first time I met him, because don't go by his youth. He has a lot of wisdom, which is very rare to find in one person. As you would have seen his biodata, it will be very difficult to describe what specialization he has. He is a historian, he is an architect, he is a planner, he is an engineer, he does mapping,
I mean, what he does not do should be the question, not what he does. So, and the most impressive thing for all the viewers who are listening is his commitment, the kind of, I think it should be a model how research should be done. In this audience, we have several researchers who are listening us, because coming all the way from USA to India on the bank of River Ganga and spending years together without much technological facility, his dedication to learn, his dedication to know this great river and contribute towards the base of knowledge or the body of knowledge about this river and this river basin is something which is amazing. And that's why I was very keen to be in touch with him and to invite him. And I'm really very thankful, Dr. Anthony, for you to accept it so gracefully and join us today. I'm quite sure people will really love and get inspired. I think it's an inspiration for common people. It's an inspiration for researchers. It's an inspiration for planners, scientists, and all of us. So, and it's my good fortune to again welcome you after a couple of years. The last time I had a chance to see your exhibition also in Delhi. And so I'm quite sure. And that book, I have that book and I have tried to go through. It's an amazing piece of work. And I would very strongly recommend those researchers, those who have interest to learn, to get across that book, and it will be really very, very useful. So I won't stand further between Dr. Anthony and all the listeners, and I will just close here. And I am also very eagerly looking forward to listening to your experience, listening to your learning and your words of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
You know, we have this, we have a system with Department of Science and Technology, Vigyan Prasar. So every month, we have last Tuesday of every month, we organize a talk on some aspects relating to Ganga. And we have been able to get really very eminent people to talk to our audience. And perhaps we will be coming up with a kind of documentation of all these lectures. So it's a kind of Ganga lecture series which we have started. And then from USA, Professor Sudipta Sen, who is in University of California. So one of the lecture was by him. Again, he is a historian and he has come up with a very, very elaborate book on the history and culture and several other aspects of Ganga. So I think this is a great opportunity. And we would really love to get benefit from you and then some other people. So we will have some conversation later on, and we will be very happy to carry forward our association with you and take Ganga Knowledge Center to further heights. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And it's such a great honor to get to be here with all of you, at least virtually. I really so very much appreciate that introduction of Director General Mishra, and of course also the very kind words from Dr. Gupta, from Dr. Srivastava, and Mr. Renade as well. It's a great pleasure again to see all of you and to get to share this work. It's an incredible honor for me. I will just pull up my slides very quickly. To share the work. Can you all see that?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So again, it's really such a distinct pleasure to get to share this work with such a large audience and the work that's being done with the NMCG. As has been mentioned so much, Ganga has played such an important role in my life. I've spent so much time there that this has been one of the longest periods of time because of the pandemic for me not to get to come to India. So I, of course, miss coming very much and hope to see all of you in person again when it's possible to do so. The talk today that I'm going to share with you is really a consolidation of the past 10 to 15 years of work on Ganga. And as many have mentioned, it's from my book, Ganges Water Machine. And I'll talk about what I mean by Ganga, a river without banks, in just a moment. But as was mentioned, I published a book out of this research called Ganges Water Machine. And the kind of, quick explanation of this book is that it's really, it's a history of the basin, of the Ganga Basin, told from the history of its infrastructure and its urban growth. And so I really look at the ways in which this basin has been transformed into one of the most hyper-engineered landscapes on the planet. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the book is really subdivided into 4 parts. The first part really looks at the cultural landscape of Ganga. So really trying to understand the layers, the cultural, the political, the ecological, the sacred geography of Ganga and how those all come together. The second part of the book looks at transforming this river basin into a water machine through the introduction of the Ganges canal system, the way that that was modeled on the Jamuna or Yamuna canal systems. And the centralization of water that happens under the East India Company and under the British Raj and onward through independence. The third part looks at the history of decentralization of water infrastructure. So let's say tube wells in particular, the growth of tube wells in the 20th and 21st century. And the fourth part, which is mostly what I'm going to focus on today, is developing a new way of imaging or visualizing this landscape, what I call a dynamic atlas. Now you might ask, well, why write a book to visualize all of these layers of the Ganga Basin? And the very kind of quick, short answer is because words and numbers fail to capture the dynamism and deep rhythms of this monsoonal landscape. So the drawings that I'm going to share with you today and the research are really about trying to thicken that description, to give more to words and numbers through drawings, through images that I've taken, some that are historical, of this basin. And in particular, I'm going to focus on how difficult it is to really draw the edges of the Ganga or Ganges. Oftentimes when we draw rivers, they're like 2 parallel lines. They look almost like they're, irregular plumbing. But I think this photograph that you can see here that I took from the Triveni Sangam in Prayagraj in UP, you can see just how murky that edge is, that zone of where Ganga ends and begins is incredibly difficult to tell. And so I really want to look at the ways in which this is not just a river in terms of water, but also perhaps more importantly, sediment and silt, like you can see here, again from Allahabad or Prayagraj, the amount of sediment that builds up that I'll talk quite a bit about, because when we start to think of Ganga not just as water and as deity, but also as soils, I think we start to really think very differently about what is the larger river basin and how it impacts, as was mentioned before, over 500 million people on a daily basis. And so I do that then through a different set of ways of drawing, of visualizing, as I mentioned before, this dynamic atlas. And so I'll explain these kinds of drawings more in just a moment. Now, this book that I've told you about, it's over 400 pages long. So there's no way that I'm going to try to tell you about it in such a short presentation. But that means then, for example, I won't be able to talk to you about why, for example, James Rennell's a map of the Ganga and description of the Ganga and Brahmaputra rivers that was read in London in the 18th century, why he had these incredibly thick descriptions of maps, of the monsoons, yet when he had to draw it, he drew something that looked like this, right? Where again, we see rivers as almost like parallel lines. And that's because colonialism and imperialism requires us to flatten space in this way, where we get drawings that look like this that are very useful when you want to march a military or collect taxes, but they in no way talk about, say, the ways in which Rennell described the vapors that are wafted from the Bay of Bengal that drench the longer Bengal region with the monsoons every year and transform the landscape. It also means that, for example, Jules Verne wrote a book called The Demon of Kanpur about a group of engineers traveling across the Ganga Basin in a steam-powered elephant. It has these beautiful descriptions of how there's almost an electric charge to the ground with the monsoons. Yet when forced to draw a map, also draws a map very similar to Rennell, like you see on the right. Again, it's a kind of flattening of space. Or when, say, we look at these yatra nakshas or these pilgrimage maps that one finds all throughout, especially the Himalayas, where here we can see all of these mandirs, right, that are at these sacred sites that are imbued with celestial significance, these terrestrial sites. We don't see any of the infrastructure that's been put in place here, the Tari Dam and other canal systems. So part of my job was really, how do we start to bring all of these layers together? Or when we go to the Ganga Canal, say in Hardwar, like we see here, or we find these kinds of calendar art, like we see here of Shiv with Ganga, right, running through Shiv's locks. How do we bring all of this kind of infrastructure together with this sacred geography, cultural landscape? And so my task was then bringing all of those layers together. And I'll talk more about how I try to do that through the methods of drawing and visualizing the basin. Now, oftentimes I think, the way that Firangis, Goras oftentimes will speak about Ganga is, say, like this BBC News series, right? Ganges, India's dying mother, like we see here, the flyover, hazy image. The BBC correspondent is joking, right? He's next to this Nala. And we'll see then, for example, kind of Jukad kind of methods of trying to do small scale, decentralized systems of cleaning the water or making it potable, drinkable, even say things like Tata Swatch, for example, of filtration devices, or what development specialists love, these kinds of life straws, right, where you stick the straw into the water and it becomes drinkable on the other side. Or, for example, small-scale technologies like you see here of this solar terracotta water filtration system to distill waters that are not potable into being 5 liters of drinkable water by a day's end, that then can be taken away like we see here. For me, all of these reproduce what is essentially this, which is, this is actually a urinal right next to the Triveni Sangam in Prayagraj that I took. And why I'm showing this image is because we can see that this is not connected to a larger system. And so what my task is really to do is, how do we bring together the small scale and the large scale together in this kind of middle zone? Because if we have a kind of middle zone form of drawing, we can start to relate these bottom-up solutions that are so important to the basin with also how those intersect with the large-scale centralized systems of, say, the Ganges Canal system and other larger canals and roadways that I'll talk about in a little bit. So my job is really bringing these, the big and the very small together where they intersect. Now, of course, I know all of you know quite well that UP, Uttar Pradesh, would be the 6th most populous country in the world, right? It's half the size of California, or the same size as Great Britain, but has over 200 million people living in it and produces close to 18% of India's food grains. That is incredible. There is no other place on the planet that has that level of density, agrarian production, and is said to still be primarily rural. So also part of rethinking the larger Ganga Basin, I would argue, also has to do with how do we redefine what it means to be urban and rural and agrarian in a place that's so densely populated and so full of infrastructure. And of course, we can see this is a drawing that I was able to acquire of the irrigation works of UP before it was split into Uttarakhand in the north. But here you can just see the amount of hydrological activity that exists within the state and within the larger basin itself. Now, of course, Ganga Basin, it's primarily in India, but it of course also overlaps with Bangladesh, China, and Nepal as well. And I try to see and use, of course, satellite imagery, but also start to develop my own drawings using GIS to some extent, geographic information systems, but also different techniques of on-the-ground visualization as well. So to show you what I mean by this being such an incredibly hyper-engineered landscape, let me show you an image of the basin. So this is the Ganga Basin here, turned at 45 degrees. And I'm sorry, you're going to hear maybe some fire trucks going by me. I'm in New York City, and this happens every so often, so I'm terribly sorry. But this is the Ganga Basin. We can see here Ganga kind of as a line. We have Yamuna or Jamuna here, and we have Bay of Bengal here, Tropic of Cancer here. Now imagine what I do is I take this and I start to look at it in layers. So I look at, say, the rain-fed agriculture, meaning agriculture that is not fed through irrigation. And then above it, I draw another layer of irrigated agriculture. You can see here, I mean, this is the Indus River Valley Basin over here. And this is, of course, Ganga and Bay of Bengal, or sorry, the kind of Sundarbans here, Bay of Bengal. There is no other part of the planet that has that kind of hydrological supersurface. And that's all of these canals, these tube wells, these tulls, these combes, etc., that are here. So this is what I mean when I say it's one of the most hyper-engineered landscapes on the planet. Now, this term, Ganges water machine, it's not mine. It actually comes from an article that was published in 1975 in Science magazine by a professor V. Lakshmi Narayana, who taught at IIT Kanpur, and an American by the name of Roger Rejuvenate, who taught at Harvard University. And they described the Ganga as this incredibly dynamic river machine, or water machine, that was underutilized. But in no way did they ever provide any drawings of this. Instead, of course, they did what oftentimes a scientific peer-reviewed journal will do. We find equations, descriptions of how to utilize it more, but nothing about visualizing this dynamism. What does this space look like? How do the cultural layers, the sacred geography intersect with the biophysical? So again, my job was to go about drawing those parts and pieces of the machine to understand it better. Now, when I say machine, I don't mean kind of like a mechanical machine like we see with this chronometer here from the 18th century. Instead, it's actually something that's more like a kind of cyborg. Like if you know this film, The Empire Strikes Back, this is Luke Skywalker's bionic hand. It's a biology with a technology, or a technology with a biology. But we can see a human hand here, but also mechanical parts. So it's this what the environmental historian Richard White would call an organic machine. And so again, understanding this organic machine, I think, is so crucial to understanding better the ways, those deep rhythms that I mentioned of the monsoons before. Now, the two principal infrastructural characters that I would say I look at are, on the one hand, those highly centralized systems like the Ganges Canal, the Ganga Canal that you see on the left, and its exact opposite, the tube well, right, for drawing up groundwater that so many millions of people within South Asia and around the world actually depend upon for drinking water and also for irrigation. So if canals are like highways for water, tube wells are the exact opposite. They're like a straw, right, that we sink into the ground, put a pump connected to it, and draw up water for drinking and agriculture. Now, the Ganga Basin became a kind of laboratory in the 19th and 20th centuries for developing a new culture around water management. And again, I'm not going to go into great detail, but essentially, if I had to do a kind of, let's say, pocket history of how this happened, the East India Company keeps moving from the larger Bengal region up the Ganga Basin through the decaying Mughal Empire. And they keep noticing that as they move further and further inland, that there are these things happening called famines. Now, rather than say that a famine is because of colonization, they would argue that it's because there's not enough water being irrigated to so many hundreds of thousands of farmers. So they propose to build this very large Ganges canal system. And this canal system is really like a super highway for redirecting water, for a highly centralized system for the East India Company. And they build the largest aqueduct in the world, the Solani Aqueduct, which passes at Roorkee, which is also where, of course, today IIT Roorkee is located. And it becomes the longest canal system in the world when it opens in 1854. So of course, just 3 years before 1857. And it goes all the way from Hardwar, all the way through the Ganga, Jamuna, Doab to originally Kanpur. And of course, today, if we look at its evolution from the 1830s all the way to the present, we can see how it, of course, goes all the way to the tip of the Doab, to Prayagraj. So this is a drawing of that evolution of this highly centralized system, which continued to grow under the Raj and since independence in 1947. And what's quite spectacular then about this, and this is where, again, this kind of soils, I think, is quite important. We can see here what's called a super passage or a flyover of the Ganga Canal system. So here is actually the river as with a flyover to pass over the canal system here. And you can see just the amount of silt that is coming down. This is during the monsoon season. So this is taken in July. Just outside of Roorkee, where we see just the amount of sediment that's coming down versus the amount of sediment in the canal system here. And what I would argue is that the monsoons are really like the great architects of this river basin in so many ways. This is a drawing showing the path of the monsoon, so drawing out from a kind of celestial scale, looking at the earth where we see, of course, India here, Bangladesh, the Himalayas here. These are a set of drawings looking at the velocity of the summer and winter monsoon, or the southwest and northeast monsoons, and how they enter and exit the subcontinent. And of course, this incredible monsoon is created because of a differential in temperature between the landmass of the subcontinent and the Bay of Bengal and larger Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea. What I do is I look not just at kind of, let's say, from plan or looking down above, like from an airplane, but I also cut vertical sections through the area to try to understand the relationship between topography and rainfall. And what I mean by that is, imagine that I think of this area of the globe as being like a very large spherical cake, and I take 5 cuts or slices through that cake, these red lines that you see here, and then I array them up at the top. So this section cut here relates to this, this, to this, so on and so forth. And what you can see, hopefully, is, of course, New Delhi is right here. We see the Himalayas here, this incredible geological landmass, the Gangetic plains, and then we see the the Bundelkhand, the Western Ghats, etc. We see this uneven bowl. And this is incredibly important because this uneven bowl is, of course, one of the most richly diversified alluvial plains on the planet. And of course, this gets created 50 million years ago when the subcontinent runs into Asia and slowly starts to crink and crimple up to create the Himalayas. So I not only then look at, say, these geometries and geographies of the Himalayas and Gangetic plains, but I also start to then plot out rainfall. And I won't go into great depth about this other than to say that, here we have again New Delhi right here. This red that you see here is the amount of rainfall in relationship to the geography. And why that's so important is that we can see just how dramatically different rainfall is across the subcontinent. Now, of course, we all know this, but I would say that if we don't draw this, how do we engage and build upon these deep rhythms? How do we incorporate them in development within the basin and to larger missions of trying to clean and rejuvenate the Ganga? We need, I would argue, these kinds of drawings to help us do this kind of work. And so I do that with all 5 of those vertical sections and look at it at different times of the year. As you can see here, these 4 times of the year, so pre-monsoon, through monsoon, and post-monsoon. And of course, we can see here during the monsoons, just the amount of rainfall versus, of course, the post and pre-monsoons. And again, I won't go into great depth about this other than to say that I'm trying to visualize very large scale data sets, along with, as I'm going to show you, small scale as well. Now, why that's important is that because between 1 and 1.6 billion tons of silt are shed every year. To give you some sense of what that scale is, the Mississippi River Basin, which has experienced quite a catastrophic set of events with Hurricane Ida in New Orleans and the larger Gulf Coast in North America, is about 1/3 of what the Ganga is. So the amount of sediment that gets moved across this landscape is also unprecedented. So for example, and I want to show you these photographs that I took in Varanasi in October of 2005. And I know all of you know quite well, the monsoons are essentially over usually by this time in a place like Banaras in October. But you can see here, just over the course of the 11th versus the 12th, how the water level goes up so much. You would think that we were tidal, that we were in a place, in the Bay of Bengal, but of course we're over 600 kilometers from the ocean or from the Bay of Bengal. And it's just because of the amount of runoff that still is happening. And we see there's no rain. And again, we look at these sets of photographs from the next 2 days, the amount of silt that gets deposited on the Ghats, right, on these steps. And then the water is going up. So it's going, it's going up and down quite a bit. And so also trying to understand this scale of the movement or choreography of soils, I think is so important to understanding the dynamism of Ganga and incorporating these deep rhythms. So my job is really to try to be almost like what an anablep is, which is this peculiar four-eyed fish, which is able to see like human beings above water and see like fish in water. So it's like I tried to grow another set of eyes, like fish eyes, along with my human eyes. So I'd be four-eyed to try to move in that muddy realm, that wet space of the larger Ganga Basin. Or what's known as a kind of like an Indian mud skipper is an even greater evolution of this, because it actually is able to adjust to see like humans above water and like fish below it. It's oftentimes called a fish that lives on land. So I try to become, and maybe not look like a mud skipper, but try to think and act like a mud skipper. And that's important then, because then if, let's say I go back to the larger Ganga Basin, this is a drawing of that groundwater potential. And you can see of all the groundwater potential in India, of course, when I draw in larger relief here, the Ganga Basin, you can see it has the greatest groundwater potential. And that's because of all that silt that's coming down from the Himalayas every year that makes the ground like a sponge, that makes it perfect for tube wells. So tube wells, of course, we find all throughout the basin. We don't have really an accurate number of how many exist or where they're located. I documented several 100,000, right? Several lakhs of tube wells across the basin. And this is, of course, a photograph of one in UP irrigating some rice paddies. But I look at, for example, why, say, we used to find films like this from the 60s by Films Division of Government of India, where a lorry is coming into a village, right, to sink a tube well. We see the water endlessly coming out. It's kind of the wet dream of development, water on demand, that we would see films like this. And of course, we know that the tube well is so important to the Green Revolution, where here we see this advertisement from 1975 from the Punjab National Bank, right, the Punjabi farmer with the high yield variety wheat over his right shoulder. We see a tube well here, we see DDT being sprayed, and of course, tractors in the background. We know that tube wells are so important to feeding so many parts of India, South Asia, and larger geographies of the world. Yet today, oftentimes what we find instead are advertisements like this that I think is so important from Crompton Greaves, right? And we see the farmer here with the bubble about the amount of water, right, that can be produced, and we see the coming out, and we see the tube well being drawn vertically, and of course a hand pump here. The fact that the tube well is so ubiquitous and is such a larger part of the Ganga Basin, that I also look, so how do we think of Ganga not just as two banks with water in it, but how is that water also connected to the groundwater supply as well, which then means that we have to think much larger territorially about the Ganga Basin. And oftentimes tube wells, right, are placed in, say, a building like this that we see and drop water, diesel powered or electric powered. We of course see hand pumps all over the place, like this image that I took in Kanpur in 2006, how incredibly important they are, not just to animal husbandry, but also to everyday life in cities. And I've written about this more extensively in the New York Times and also in the Indian Express about the relationship between groundwater and the choreography of soil and peoples. And I'd be happy to answer more questions, but I won't speak at length more about this, other than to say I try to engage not just through the drawings, but also through words and numbers as well, the larger conditions and stakes of the Ganga Basin. Now, I think it's important to take you a step back, and Director General Mishra had mentioned before kind of the technologies that I had. So imagine that I I start to do this work in 2004 to map the Ganga Basin. And in 2004, some of the best books that I could find were, say, Raghuveer Singh's The Ganges or Ganga. It's a photo essay. I could find irrigation projects in India, like you see here, which was this kind of avalanche of numbers, histories of cartography, like mapping an empire, or Slowly Down the Ganges, this madcap adventure where Eric Newby travels the length of the Ganges, and by the end of it, it's so difficult his wife divorces him. So these were some of the best books that I could find from the 20th century and 21st centuries of the basin, but nothing about what does it look like for so many millions of people to live here. Google Earth was extremely low resolution at that time, so it wasn't very useful. Drones were in existence, but they were being used for nefarious ends, mostly in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. I certainly didn't have access to small drones like this. The GRACE satellite system existed, which is about measuring groundwater through gravitational pull of the Earth, or Earth's gravity field. But it was so low resolution that it wasn't very useful for me. And all that I came to India with was really a handheld GPS, Garmin eTrex GPS, like you see here on the left, and a Nikon camera that you see on the right, to try to start to develop what I call a dynamic atlas, a way of imaging the cycles of the monsoons and how they transform the landscape of cities and agriculture every year. Now, when I got to India, I had hoped that I could find contemporary maps, but I couldn't really find contemporary maps. And actually, oftentimes I would ask, if I worked for the CIA, which of course I didn't, and not that anybody would say they did, but I didn't. So I really had to go out and be my own barefoot cartographer. So these are just a few photos of me in the Himalayas, and then also in the Gangetic Plains, to be my own barefoot cartographer. And I show you this photograph of me here, not because of how bad I look with long hair. I know it's not very flattering, but because here I'm in UP in 2006, and hopefully you can see here all that silt that's going about. I'm in the middle of a dust storm in the middle of UP because of the amount of dry silt and sand that's there. And so it's not just then that the Ganga is land and water, mud, and deity, but it's also dust and atmosphere. So kind of Ganga is all around. And so I'm trying to understand all of those different layers again of it. And so I went from Gangotri Glacier at Gomukh in the Himalayas, about almost 4,000 meters above sea level, through the Gangetic Plains, taking over 25,000 photographs of the Ganga Basin to document it, just the incredibly rich diversity of life, of agriculture, cities, biodiversity that exists. The book, I had to finish it at Varanasi, but it actually extended all the way, the work, into Bihar and Patna, and now even all the way into the larger Bay of Bengal. The city that I really focus probably the most on is the city of Allahabad or Prayagraj. And of course, as you all know so well, Prayag is right at the confluence of Ganga that you see here, Yamuna here to the south, and then of course, here the Triveni Sangam, where for so many the Saraswati is as well. And I think this satellite image is so useful from 2004, because even though we can't really read building grain quite so well, we can see though just how dynamic Ganga is versus Yamuna. And of course, that's because of the nature of the soils. Ganga is primarily fed by the Himalayas, whereas Jamuna is actually primarily fed by the Chambal. And so it has a very different sediment regime that flows through it. And so even here, just in the way of the geometries and of geography of the river channels, we can see a very different set of personalities that has so much to do with soil and sediment. So part of my job was to understand not only why the city's edges look this way, but also the larger geography here of all that beige and green that you see throughout. So trying to contextualize this city more generally. And there's been some really fantastic work that I got to build upon, like by Indra Bir Singh, who sadly passed away not that long ago, who was at Lucknow University, studied a great deal the cross-section of the sandbars at the Triveni Sangam. And so these are some photographs from 1977 that Professor Singh had published, looking at the channels and the basin. And of course, even here we can see the kind of cropping, the farmers that are here within this area, and the sandbars more generally from the 1970s. Well, I try to combine that kind of photography with cartography, and some of the best drawings that I could really find of Prague or of Allahabad was this calendar art. And I think these are such fantastic drawings because they draw together the celestial and the terrestrial layers of the basin. So of course, here we can see Ganga, Jamuna, Ganga, Saraswati, but we also see, a South Indian mandir. We see Akbar Kila or Allahabad Fort, the railroads, etc. There's a bringing together of these layers, and of course, here to the right, we see bathing at the Triveni Sangam, along with again the kind of trifecta of Ganga, Saraswati, and Jamuna or Yamuna. And bringing that sacred and terrestrial all together was, again, such an important part of this work. And we can even see then where those two rivers are said to meet, the Triveni Sangam, the kind of blue waters of the Jamuna, and the brown gray waters of the Ganga. Again, it's because of those soils. And for me, this is a kind of microcosm of the dynamism of the entire basin, right? The Triveni Sangam is never a stable line. It's constantly shifting and changing. And so then the drawings that I produced, these drawings that are cartography and photography, I'll show you and I'll walk you through them, the ways in which I image how the rivers expand and contract in relationship to the larger edges of the basin, and then how I photograph this area as well. So, and all of these drawings, these were done without GIS layers or base maps. I had to do all of this work myself, which is again why it took so long. Now, these tones of violet that you see here on the left, those tones of violet correspond to different moments throughout the year. So what I do is I use the Earth's revolution about the sun that you see here. I use the solstices and the equinoxes as kind of points along this line. And so I take that ellipse of the Earth going about the sun and I make it into a straight line. And then these different tones of violet that you see here relate to those different times of the year. So you can see how much Ganga and Jamuna expand and contract both horizontally and of course vertically as well. And so if we say, look at it in the month of April versus May, June, August, September, and then I start to draw all of the other layers, right? So the tanks and the nalas, the drains, the settlement patterns that exist here, the roadways, and again, building all of these layers myself, and bring that all together, hopefully we can see a much thicker description of how this area changes every year with the monsoons. But I don't just do that. I also would go to the Sangam and I would photograph it as a kind of panorama every year, kind of click, 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 click like this. So this is during Magh Mela, right? So January, February, where we can see this huge temporary festival that happens, this temporary city with all of the electricity lines, that the tents, the pandals, the temporary structures. And here you can see that time of year, it's during where we're at with that tone of violet. And I draw then in plan, kind of cartographically, cultivated lands, roadways, settlement patterns, population density or people, and then a kind of summation. What's important about this is that what I'm going to show you is really one of the most intelligent uses of space that I've ever witnessed in my life, which is this area goes from being this densely populated temporary city to being agricultural in 2 weeks. Farmers move in, they use the grid of the city for agriculture, they start to harvest their crops, the monsoons occur, and completely wash everything away. And so this happens, of course, every year. this is such an intelligent use of space because it really builds upon the rhythms of the monsoons. And for me, this is so important to build upon these rhythms because so much more of the world is going to look like the Ganga Basin in terms of confronting these issues, in terms of environmental uncertainty, and especially with climate change, that there's so much we can learn from the Ganga Basin in terms of how people incorporate the rhythms of the monsoon and its temporality into everyday life. And so then this is a kind of summation of all of those layers of photographs that I was mentioning to you before. And these drawings have been cited, say, in the UN Habitat's Quito papers, and in particular because of the way that I draw these biophysical layers, the sacred geography, etc., of the area. And of course, we know this also is where the Kumbh Mela happens. This is a photograph from 2013 that I took, where of course we see all of these pontoon bridges, the electricity lines, the silt. We see all the pandals, right, that are quite impressive, just really amazing to see this. And of this 80 to 100 million people that pass through here, that of course everyone in India knows so well, that's inhabited 24 hours a day. But what I would say is, of course, this is amazing. But what's so amazing is that it goes from this to this in 2 weeks, right? We see here farmers cropping. We see that because the water table level is so high that we can dig very shallow to irrigate our crops. We see the former grid of the cities here, of the roads. And then of course we can see here tattooed on the landscape then where the tents used to be, and of course the road. So it's like a drawing at the scale of the territory. And of course, it's not just used for agriculture and for the Kumbh and Magh Melas, but it's also a space of recreation as well, right? We see the water buffalo wallas along with pujas happening, recreation. There's incredible amounts of activity that are happening. Of course, all of the sand mining or sand extraction that happens in the basin as well. And so I also take that technique and apply it to what's called a transect, or a swath of land as well. So it's not just that I'm looking at a city, but a transect is literally a swath of land that goes from ridgeline to shoreline. It builds very much on the work of Patrick Geddes, who was a biologist who became a planner, who did a lot of work in India in the 20th century. And this is a drawing that he did called the valley section that goes from ridgeline to shoreline. And what's important here is that he looks at the environments from ridgeline to shoreline and the kinds of occupations, so miner all the way to fishermen with, of course, woodman, hunter. So there's a way in which he's trying to combine nature and culture together, which of course is so oftentimes seen, especially in the West, as being at odds. But instead, how are they co-authoring space? And I build upon then the work of landscape architects like Ian McCarr that use this as a design tool as well. So I take that same technique of drawing a transect to 6 different transects of the Ganga Basin. So if this is the Ganga here we have Prayag, here we have Varanasi. Imagine that then what I want to understand is not the river again as 2 parallel lines, but as a larger basin. So these transects are going perpendicular to the river edge. And I won't belabor this too much other than to show you how I then use the same techniques that I use for Allahabad to do also larger swaths of land. So these tones of violet that you see here, they relate to how Ganga expands and contracts over time. I drew all of the roadways as well. In each of those 6 transects, the settlement patterns, all of the tanks, the tals, the kumbhs that exist here, all of the drains and the nalas, and I bring that all together again to try to understand those layers. So think about it, the kinds of drawings that I'm making here, if you think about them like fashion, they're more like, they're usually cartographic drawings are like couture, meaning they're like wedding season. Like, you get your suit or your sari that you really only wear for your wedding, right? And so it's very much fitted to you at a particular moment in time. But instead, these drawings are much more like the kinds of clothing you would get at like Big Bazaar or at H&M. They're ready to wear. You gain a few kilos, lose a few kilos, they still fit. It's what in apparel design is called an inseam allowance. So these drawings are about how do you account for that expanding and contraction, or when you gain weight and lose weight, right? So all of this then I can go deeper into in terms of developing these transects, so zooming in even more for finer grain analysis, like you see here, of going to even into greater depth of groundwater extraction, agricultural cropping, during different times of the year, so maize versus wheat, peas, sugarcane, etc. But I do all of that to also better then rethink, how do we think about these nalas as spaces for wetlands, so that we can develop soft infrastructures like bioswales and wetlands to deal with some of the most pressing issues of pollution and environmental remediation that we can do in the basin. So when we start to think of nalas also then as being extremely dynamic, how do we incorporate those into the larger agendas of trying to clean and rejuvenate Ganga? And then develop other techniques of drawing that, again, I won't go into great detail, but I also make my own instruments for mapping this area. And the last part I'll say then about this is that I make these instruments to map out sediment. So remember, I didn't have many high technologies, so I had to do my old kind of like jugad, or my own kind of winging it technology. So for example, I made what I call a surface accumulation sleeve, which is literally a prosthetic that I would wear over my arm, that had that Garmin eTrex GPS system that you see here, along with packaging tape that I would use to then take soil samples. So this is a kind of zoom out of that prosthetic that you see here. And this, I would go perpendicular to the river edge and leave an imprint like this. So it's kind of like I'm working, you know how Spider-Man shoots the web from his wrist? Well, I'm kind of shooting packaging tape from my wrist, going a kilometer perpendicular to get these soil samples to better understand particle size, to do particle size analysis. And so I developed this instrument further as something that you could wear to do this kind of analysis. And I've exhibited it at places in Seoul in South Korea, and certainly also in Mumbai at the Nehru Science Center, and in Delhi as well, where Director General Mishra was kind enough to officiate some time ago. But this technology is a lot like this video game that was developed in Japan by Takahashi called Katamari Damacy. So it's a video game of this little prince who's trying to create new cosmos. And he has this little ball that you see here that, right, it's like a magnet. So spoons, darts, scissors attached to it, but also jungle gyms and entire cities start to. And the reason I'm showing this is because that packaging tape, it's not just that it's picking up soils, it's picking up hair follicles, plastic bottles, auto parts. It allows me to do a kind of ethnography of soil in this area. And so I made these machines then also to analyze the different soils, as well as the cultural detritus, the remnants of humans that also get left there as well. And so these are some examples of those techniques of working between the field and the laboratory. And what I did was I scanned several hundred kilometers of this packaging tape, and you can see that the soil here, for example, right? And we can see these different sizes of sediment. Well, what I would do was I would use the magic wand tool, which the magic wand tool might be used in Photoshop for something like this, when say you want to put a fake tattoo on someone's chest. But instead, I misuse the magic wand in order to do this kind of work, because the magic wand actually allows me to break down the different particle sizes. So I can do my own kind of do-it-yourself remote sensing particle size analysis of the basin. So I used the wrong thing for the right purpose in this work. And I didn't just develop this and map out these soils and their textures, but I also developed what I call the Ganga Dip Sock, where I bought 100 pairs of pristine white tube socks, and I would dip them into the sediment of the Ganga, like you see here, to collect soil samples, to do, again, different forms of analysis. So I use different techniques that are very much available to us on an everyday basis to take measure of this region more generally. And so this is exhibiting and showing that kind of Ganga Dip Sock. But I'm able to then make these kinds of drawings that you see here with these very low-tech ways of working that I think is just really important, because I think, of course, other people can use these techniques as well, so that we can start to build up from the ground up new forms of data sets that intersect again with those kind of larger satellite imagery that we have. And of course, have transformed remote control cars into what I call a surface accumulation rover, like you see here. So this is a remote control car that I then transformed into a rover so that I wouldn't have to hurt my back kind of shooting the packaging tape like at Spider-Man's web. And I've exhibited this, of course, at Neuroscience Center, as I mentioned before, to try to engage a larger audience across the subcontinent. So these are some of those drawings I showed you before, animations and physical models, and people watching these videos of Ganga's descent. And of course, here, even using mannequins in Delhi, where you can see that the Ganga Dip Sock here, as well as the surface accumulation sleeve, and taking students of architecture and engineering through to explain how these instruments work, and the photographs, to try to, again, engage a larger public in Seoul, South Korea, as well, of allowing people to build up their own drawings and images of the Ganga Basin. Again, that kind of Ganga Dip Sock. So I try to work, and I'll conclude here really with working at the scale of soil structures, like you see here, all the way through an urban level to a larger regional and of course celestial scale. And the mediums then that I use is of course the book. I use op-eds and exhibitions and workshops. And I want to say that for me, this is so important, because I think that one can be brilliant at what they do, but if you can't share this with a larger audience, you're going to lead a very lonely revolution. So I try to engage larger publics so that we can build a greater consciousness and awareness of the incredible dynamism of Ganga, and how we can build upon the deep rhythms and the intelligence that already exists on the ground. Because going forward, I really see the Ganga Basin as being a laboratory that can start to export techniques of living with environmental uncertainty to other parts of the world, as opposed to importing them. And I think this is such an incredible challenge and opportunity to build upon, again, this incredible level of intelligence, so that we can move beyond the kind of the static, flattened image of a river basin, but hopefully engage its larger cultural, political, and sacred layers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful presentation and sharing the wonderful work you have done on Ganga River. Thank you so much, sir. I'm taking some of the questions there in our chat box. So, sir, the very first question is, according to you, what are the major steps we should take to rejuvenate or to have a healthy Ganga back?
Wow, that's a very concise question. That's a very difficult answer to do in a kind of made-for-TV Zoom answer. So I would say, I'll try to be very brief. I would say that part of what I would argue we want to do, and I know has already started to be done, is to how do we start to draw and describe the Ganga Basin differently than typically we have of rivers as being parallel lines. So I think drawing and description are so crucial to this. The second thing that I think is so important is to understand that when it comes into rejuvenation, so much of the pollution that enters the stream of Ganga comes through nalas. And so understanding the ways that we might engage these conduits and develop soft infrastructures is so crucial. And the third, I would say, is understanding the relationship then between surface water and groundwater, which I think is also so important. So thinking of Ganga as a basin, which of course is part of the, I think really the national mission Clean Ganga as an authority is really as a basin. And so that we can think about groundwater, surface water, and the ways in which those intersect with one another to address issues of groundwater extraction and of course Ganga rejuvenation. That's my really earnest attempt at trying to answer, which is such an important and good question, but not an easy one to do. And I also should say, I should defer really to those here that I think have been working on this, of course, much longer and more extensively than me.
Thank you, sir. That's wonderful. The next question is, you have spoken about Ganga as a water machine, which churns up enormous water resources for its densely populated millions. How do your experience during your stay in India in Ganga Basin compare to your present sitting as urban planner studies in Yale University? Do you have some comparative dimension to elaborate on your global experience on this?
This is, again, such a good question and not an easy one to answer, but what I would say is that I think that most river basins have been radically transformed around the world. There are very few that we don't find that aren't not co-authored by people and by, of course, larger forces of the environment. So I always try to think of us as being really entangled with the environment and not like this. But I think what's so incredible about the Ganga Basin is that on the one hand, I've said that it's so hyper-engineered, yet it's also still incredibly dynamic in a way that, say, the Mississippi River Basin has been radically transformed because of the Army Corps of Engineers building all of these levees and barrages. So even though we have all of these bunds, right, and these barrages in the Ganga Basin, still because of the monsoons, it really transforms this area. So the monsoons, as I mentioned before, they're like the great architects in so many ways. Like, we really have to think about the Ganga is not just here, but also here, that's coming down us, right? Like, I didn't show and talk about Ganga's descent, but I do think the way in which we know Ganga's descent from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, right, of coming through Shiv's hair, I think is an incredibly powerful tool when we think of then Ganga not as, again, parallel lines, but as Shiv's sopping wet hair. And I realize I don't want to say that Ganga, of course, is purely a deity. Of course, it's incredibly important for so many people as that. But when we think also in that way, I think that there's such incredible power in thinking of the river basin then is something very different as a basin when we think about it as almost like sopping wet hair. And to that end, then, of course, there are all kinds of things that we need to do to try to live with that incredible dynamism. And certainly things have been done like the Ganges Canal, tube wells, etc., which have their pros and cons that too difficult to try to go into in this moment. But it's to say that I think because of the monsoons, Ganga is so incredibly unique, and because of the population density, but that environmental uncertainty that the monsoons produce is so useful for other parts of the world to learn from, because with climate change and climate disruption, more and more parts of the world are going to experience that same level of extreme of drought and flooding that, like, UP, it used to be, I don't know if it's still the case, experiences the most drought and most flooding of any of India's states, if I remember correctly, or at least that used to be the case. So I think those extremes more and more parts of the world are contending with. And here again, I think Ganga Basin has so much to teach us about how to incorporate that and adapt rather than trying to geoengineer and fight, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is that you have shown extremely intense utilization of groundwater through offsite tube wells in Ganga Basin. This may be one of the factors sustaining river landscape in present times, and may in fact be the counterproductive when we look at rejuvenation of this huge machine as a huge machine. A balance is indeed needed between the unsustainable harvesting and livelihood nexus. How do you view, given your own first-hand interaction during the course of stay in the hinterland of Ganga?
Boy, again, these questions, they're so good and not, they're short questions that deserve such long, more extensive answers. But what I would say is that I think that, and I didn't talk about it much in that drawing, but those transects that I showed of the settlement patterns in kind of in central and eastern UP, what's important, I think, to draw our attention to is that the tube well allows for an incredibly diffuse form of urbanization. And what I mean by that is that historically, many of those parts of UP that I was showing, urban settlement, village settlement happened around surface water bodies, right? So tanks, kunds, tals, etc. But the tube well allows for settlement to happen in areas that don't have surface water bodies. And when you have the level of density that UP does, by building so many impermeable surfaces of houses, it really detracts from groundwater recharge during the monsoons. So what that does is that provides an opportunity. It's of course a problem, but it provides an opportunity to then start to say, well, how do we start to allocate spaces, larger spaces, so that we can have the monsoons recharge the aquifers, which might mean that we just don't create a space for aquifer recharge, but how do we maybe make parks and recreation and new forms of public space? How do we develop new 21st century step wells and kunds and baulis for the Ganga Basin that incorporate and build civic infrastructure around this and not just monofunctional infrastructure? If India has taught me anything, which has taught me so many, but I would say one of the most important things that I learned in the Ganga Basin is that infrastructure, even when an engineer tries to make it monofunctional to do just one thing, it does many other things. So how do we think of infrastructure as doing many things to incorporate the monsoons and do aquifer recharge, new forms of public space, and settlement patterns? And again, I think that there's just so much that we can learn from and do by incorporating those deep rhythms of the monsoons. And that's so important then for groundwater, to bring it back directly to groundwater recharge and extraction.
Thank you so much, sir. Anything from your side, Piyush, sir? Any comments from DG, sir, or Jagmohan, sir?
Yeah, Anthony, I think some of the questions drew really nice insight. I was also thinking, like what you said about groundwater, surface water to be together, and a very interesting point which you said about the new public space could be created. At present, we are also trying to, apart from developing the infrastructure for pollution abatement and also ecological thing, we are also trying to work about sensitizing urban planners. Because I think, see, you know very well the population density and then the pressure and for constructing houses and habitations. And urbanization is also very diffuse. So I think it starts, I mean, you really don't know the boundary. There may be legal boundary, but basically peri-urban areas and villages also develop urban characteristics. So I think this is a major challenge to sensitize the planners. And river area can be very good public space if we maintain it well, and aquifer recharge and all those things. So we are trying to develop, and we will request your insight also. We are working with the concerned ministry and trying to develop a kind of river sensitive master plan. And primarily what I am saying is trying to develop a paradigm, a special paradigm for planning for river cities. And as you said, I think it could be river, basically surface water, or maybe a big lake where the civilization starts developing. So can you tell us or can you reflect and tell us about it? And we will share some of our papers or something which we are trying to do, because we looked at in India. So there is not much, I mean, the master plans are there and there are few good examples, but not many good examples of planning for river in the urban master plan or city master plan. There are some good international examples. So we are trying to actually work on a project with the like-minded people and some of the people. So can you basically reflect and quickly give us some idea, and also maybe what comes to your mind in a very well-planned river city, I mean, anywhere in the world, I mean, what immediately comes to your mind? So something like that, that will really help us. And we are trying to engage the young students also who are writing thesis and all that. So recently we started a competition, and then now we are going to again start the season 2 of that competition. And maybe we will also open it to the international students also, because we will get perhaps, and these young students, PhD students or master's students, they brought really good ideas about river bank, about this groundwater, urban groundwater and all that. So we are actually thinking aloud and doing a lot of things on this direction to develop a kind of thinking, develop a kind of curriculum. So I think we will be benefited from your experience. You know India, you also know the global cities and then the planning river, and so let's look at river cities and try to get something, some insight from you. Like what are perhaps, if we have to look at few river cities globally, where we should go and then what we should study further.
I would welcome that opportunity, and it's so wonderful to hear that that this initiative is being undertaken, because I think it's so crucial. So I would really welcome that opportunity, and I think that the history also of Varanasi is so fascinating, because that was a city that I know we all think of it so much today in terms of the Ghats and Ganga, but when we look at drawings of it in the 18th and 19th century, Varanasi used to be a city of orchards and kunds and halls. And it was really this incredibly elaborate system of water management to deal with the monsoons and the larger channel of Ganga. And so I think that also in the DNA of so many cities in the Ganga Basin, we can also learn so much from as well, not to try to go back, because obviously we can't go back to the 18th and 19th century, but I do think that there's so much that we can learn from the intelligence that's there, that's still built in the form of those cities. So again, I would really welcome the opportunity to work with you all on that, because I would learn so much from it as well.
Thank you so much, sir.
I think, thank you. This is a very good example, because we are also working on the kunds of Varanasi, as you very rightly said. So there is a lot to learn from the old traditions, whether in Ganga Basin or other part of the India. So I think similarly for irrigation also, there are a lot of very good natural things we have found, like some of the wetlands. Like when, as you very rightly marked the season, when there is more water in the river, it goes to the wetlands, and there is some sort of natural channels are there. And sometimes when river needs water, it goes back. So what you said, surface and groundwater thing, nature actually has all these things, but somehow we temper. And as you say, perhaps this hyper engineering sometimes becomes too much without getting into depth of what was naturally available. So we would be very happy to carry that information. Recently, we have also found out, because you worked in Prayagraj area, Kausambi. So between Kanpur and Prayagraj, we have got a trace of some aquifer underground, a kind of channel kind of thing. I mean, basically between Yamuna and Ganga. So I think we are trying to do some heli survey and using new technology, trying to trace that that route of that with national NGRI, some of the expert institutions. So I think it's a kind of interesting thing. So several things may be hidden in the earth, which perhaps if we know little more about it, it will be perhaps making this basin even more interesting from water management point of view or from civilization point of view.
Definitely, that's amazing. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sir. Please go ahead, sir. Yeah, Anthony, sir, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that that also sounds like an exciting and fascinating project as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Rajiv, sir. Thank you, Anthony, sir. It's really blessing for us to hear your journey, and we all are overwhelmed with your experiences on Ganga River. Now I invite DP Mathuria, sir, the Executive Director Technical NMCG, to conclude the session. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. It had been a very fascinating and interesting discussion. The profile of questions has been too interesting, and it was really a learning experience. Well, it is always an experience to hear to Dr. Anthony. I had an opportunity to had been a participant in the lecture that he gave in National Mission to Clean Ganga, and also had visited the exhibition back here in Delhi about 2-3 years back. And I in fact was fascinated with the kind of instrumentation and kind of rudimentary apparatuses that he had utilized to map the vastness of this water machine, as he calls. In fact, truly it's a water machine. And this lecture has been truly fascinating for a number of reasons. I don't know how to dissect this entire lecture, but I'll try to do some profiling of it. In fact, the lecture offers a very insightful picture into not only to the cartographic aspects of mapping that Dr. Anthony during his stay in India in Ganga Basin went through, but also the layers, the slices, whether it is culture, whether it is the water machine which is churning up the monsoon into a river system and then harvesting the water for its enormous population. Also for the land use, for the canal system, it has been a remarkable journey. In fact, if you look at innovative cartographic skills, they appear to be too good to understand. Anybody who has an understanding of cartography and map, he'll be fascinated. In fact, the slicing of the entire basin into 5 those slices, and then orography versus rainfall versus the impacts in different time scales, they have been truly an experience for any student or any learner of any age. So it had been a tremendous experience, as I've said. We also learned so many exciting terminology. For example, it is not only a water machine but an organic machine. See, this word carries a lot of impact. It is not a landscape but a monsoonal landscape. The river is in its adolescent youth and vigor during the monsoon, and then matures during non-monsoon period, and that's how. And then entire lecture took us from the time when the canal system was conceptualized, and a beautiful picture of Sir Cotley was shown when first time the canal was conceptualized and constructed, and then how that water is being used across the entire hinterland. And then the lecture and the book dwelt upon the dynamism of this river system, both in space and time. So the experience has taken us to the different height, to the different level of understanding. And I personally, in fact, I have had an opportunity to go through some of the sections of the book, not the entire book. I personally recommend that one should go through the book, read it to the extent he can, and understand the kind of inputs and insight, as well as the belongingness with which the entire the book has been brought about. So a lot of thanks for such an exciting and an interesting lecture. I'll at this stage I'd like to thank everyone. We had, I'm told that we had about 5,000 plus participants in the lecture, which comprised of students from the Vigyan Prasar, researchers, the researchers from the universities, scientists, or people from Ganga Vichar Manch, and so on and so forth. So a tremendous upsurge of participants has been exhibited. We had an equally energetic participation from Vigyan Prasar scientists. I'll especially like to thank Dr. Ravindra Ranade, scientist staff, Dr. Narwaria, Dr. Nidhi, Dr. Vipin, who had been in fact catalyst in having this every Tuesday, every last Tuesday of the month kind of series. And obviously the patronage of Director General National Mission for Clean Ganga, Mr. Jagmohan Gupta, our advisor, all us fellows at National Mission for Clean Ganga, and last but not least, Dr. Anthony, who has in fact provided such a insightful journey during for the period during which he stayed in the Ganga Basin and brought out such a worthy and book and a publication to go through. Thanks for this exciting lecture for this today's series. And with this, thanks, Dr. Anthony.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and we would be in touch.
Thank you so much. And again, it's such a great honor to get to share this work with all of you. And thank you so much for the invitation. It means a lot, and I hope to see you all very soon.